As I said, I just want to practice applying all the stuff that we've learned with you a little bit. The overall aim of this class is not that you know 12 different topics, but that you do understand the basics of financial markets and financial institutions management. That's what I'm after. So you should understand the whole picture. And that's the reason why in the exam and now towards the end, we put everything together. And that's the reason why I also refer so often to the first few classes that we had in the beginning of the semester, because everything is connected. That's the whole reason why we talked about forwards and futures, for example, why we talked about the yield curve, because all these things are also important for monetary policy and for risk management of banks. Everything is connected. So students asked me to have more and more practice, and that's the reason why I uploaded some additional material here. So you can find that under Learning Resources, and it is here, additional practice material. And here what I did is I looked up quite a few of articles over the time. Let me see, I'm just picking one. This one is always a hot one. New York Times article about tranches, basically. Tranches, securitization. That's an exceptionally long one. The other articles are much shorter. And what I did here is somewhere in that article, for all these articles, I put some self-check questions in. So, of course, I read the articles too. And then I thought, like, okay, what are good questions here? So when you read the article, you should be able to figure out the answers for these questions, the article combined with your knowledge. They're not necessarily easy questions, and warning, they're practice questions, they're not exam questions. So don't try to figure out all the answers, put them on the cheat sheet, and think that you get an A in the exam because you've got these answers. Of course, the exam will always have variations to it. But in the exam, I use articles too. And in fact, to be a little bit fair, what I did is I used little snippets out of different articles. And the articles you either had in your quiz reading already, or the articles are part of this group here. Plus, you will never get a whole article in the exam. In fact, I reckon you can even survive without the article very often. But I think it's better if you've seen the article before, and it gives you good practice. Gives you a little bit of a feel for what's going on. So each of these articles has questions attached to it. So it gives you a little bit of a feeling how I'm thinking and how you can attack day-to-day life and what you see in the news with all the knowledge that we have here. I'm happy to discuss these. There will for sure not be a solution manual for all these questions, because the whole point is that you figure things out for yourself and scratch your head. I'm perfectly happy, though, to talk about it, especially on our Facebook side, if you have specific questions. But a specific question is not, what is the answer? A specific question is, well, I figured out this and this and this much, but I'm not sure about this bit. And then I'm happy to help. So, some current issues. What do we have here? Banks face cash squeeze as fund managers and households draw down on deposits. So I think that's a little bit related to the article that I gave you for today's class as well, where they talked about LIBOR and oasis spread, and where they said that banks have trouble with their so-called funding gap. I'll let you read this one here first. Okay. So we want to use the stuff that we've learned in class to look a little bit over this one, what's happening here. First of all, I should say I'm going to be a tiny bit critical about this one, but this one is NAP, Global Head of Research, Peter Jolly. He means the right thing, but the way it's phrased is kind of wrong. And we play with this one a little bit. Some data about that one too. So what he's talking about is there's a difference between bank loans and deposits. So for whatever reason, this number here is fluctuating. And right now, bank loans increased by more than deposits. And the difference between bank loans and deposits increased to 457 billion. And they call that one a funding gap. And there all the alarm bells should ring already. Because what did we learn in this class? How do banks make loans? Do they have to wait for somebody to deposit their money and then lend to somebody else, as you learned in macroeconomics? Potentially learned it in macroeconomics? No, banks can create deposits. When banks are creating a new loan, at the same time they create a new deposit. If a bank is giving you a $100 loan, they're giving you at the same time a $100 deposit. So loans and deposits on first sight should go up and down equally. So that seems a bit confusing here that there's a gap. But there is a gap, that is true. But the question is why? We have to figure that out step by step. And they're arguing there, well, it's because the fund managers and co, they get out of deposits and buy short-term securities. Or they get out of deposits in Australia and buy overseas assets. Sounds reasonable. However, if you know the details, it's not that straightforward. Let's try that together. So I want to try what they say here is the leaking of deposits several ways. One channel in recent quarters has been domestic fund managers allocating away from cash and deposits into other asset classes, particularly overseas. Let's do domestic first. It's a bit easier. So I've got a bank here. Bank A, there's of course equity, there's ESF, blah, blah, blah. But I want to focus on this one here first, the deposits. So let's say the fund manager has 100 in deposits and he thinks, well, that's not really giving us a good return. We want to do something else. And just as we said in the newspaper article there, the fund manager wants to go into a different asset class. For example, the fund manager wants to buy government bonds. So how does that look like? So let's say for the fund manager, he's got the deposits here, are liability for the bank. For the fund manager, deposits are, of course, if you have deposits, is that for you a liability or an asset? Asset, it's good. So this one here is the 100 here in deposits. So the fund manager wants to buy bonds. And let's say he's doing that one. So he's the blue guy here. So he marches off with dollars. And he wants to switch his dollars and want to get in return bonds. Right, certain face value here. You don't care too much about the face value. Coupons, you know what a bond is. How does that look on the accounts here? Maybe let's do it for the fund manager first. So what will happen to his deposits? Let's say he's spending all his deposits on bonds. What will happen to his deposits? If you spend all your deposits, they're going down from 100 to 0. So minus 100, but in return, he's getting, of course, the bonds. So plus 100 bonds. So far, so good. On the bank account, of course, his 100 deposits are gone too, because he went shopping. Minus 100. But now it's starting to get trickier. Where are these deposits? Are they just disappearing? There's something missing. So if you go shopping and you pay someone, we need that someone here too. And let's use a different person here. So that person here is receiving the dollars and gives away the bond. So he made a deal, Mr. Blue made a deal with Mr. Red. Now the money that flows here, is that cash or electronic money deposits? If the fund manager is buying $10 million in bonds and he's not super dodgy, electronic transfer, of course. So these deposits here, they might disappear from his account, but let's say, for example, Mr. Red has his account at Bank B, they're coming here, of course. So now these two banks have to settle with each other. So let's say they have real-time gross settlement. So immediately here the ESF is going up by plus 102. And here we have minus 100 of ESF. So now everything is balanced again, I hope. Well, the 50, but you can see what I did here, right? Minus 100 on both sides, plus 100 on both sides. But remember the story that we wanted to explain. Leakage of deposits. Australian banks suffer, blah, 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 because fund managers are allocating away from cash deposits to other classes. So if one fund manager allocates away out of deposits to other classes, does that mean there's less bank deposits in the banking system? No, we just reshuffled them from one account to another account, right? So that by itself doesn't explain why we have less deposits in the banking system, because now we have exactly the same amount of deposits in the banking system as beforehand. They're just sitting with another bank. So that explanation is of no good at this moment. So we have to think of a different way to explain it. Let's check another way. Let's say, for example, we've got Mr. Red here. Mr. Red also had a loan beforehand. All along here. And one of the reasons why he was selling the bond was because he wanted to get rid of their loan. Makes sense, right? You want to repay your loan, you've got bonds, you sell the bonds to someone else at an attractive price, your deposit account goes up, now you have the deposits, what you could do is you repay the loan. Everybody on board? So now you use the deposits, repay your loan, deposits gone, loan gone. So now really we have less deposits in the banking system. But what happens to loans? Also down. And that means the gap between loans and deposits here. If loans and deposits go down by the same amount, which of course they do if you repay your loan, this number here, the difference between loan and deposits shouldn't go up, should stay the same. So again, this is not a good explanation. People repaying their loans is not explaining why we have like a difference between loans and deposits. People buying other assets classes does not explain why we have a difference between loans and deposits. So we've got to scratch our head and come up with an example that can explain that number. So it's not super obvious. Basically, I'm going there step by step. We are canceling out all the options that don't work. I'll put you on the right track. Now this bank here is of course happy. They've got plenty of liquidity. Loans and deposits both went down, but that's not a problem. So this bank looks fairly good here. Let's look at this bank here. So once their customer bought other assets and therefore paid with their deposits, these deposits here went down. That is not a problem for the bank, but the problem is here. When the bank has to settle with other banks, they had to use ESF. And remember, banks usually have very, very little ESF, right? They don't have the same amount of ESF as deposits. So this is a big chunk possibly for this bank. Now this bank here might feel a little bit illiquid. Right? They might want to get more ESF. And there's different ways of getting ESF. So we know we can borrow ESF, or we can sell bonds that we have. So for example, if this bank had some bonds, they could do repos or sell it simply to another bank or in the market. But they could do something else too. They could try to find another source of funding here. And that becomes more linked up with what was in the article. And also what we had sometimes in the presentation. So Australian banks use a lot of wholesale funding, which means that they themselves issue securities. They themselves issue bonds in the international market or Australian market. And let's see how that one looks like. So if this bank gets the idea now to issue bonds, $50. So that basically means they made new pieces of paper, bonds, that they have to sell to someone. Let's say they sell it to someone here. It's a different one than this one. So this guy here has a lot of hair. He wants to buy bonds. And in return, of course, they should get money in. Right? That's the whole reason why any kind of corporation or bank is issuing bonds, because they want to get funding in. And let's make our example super easy. This guy here who bought the bank bond is actually that household here. So he's got the bank account at that same bank that is issuing the bond. That makes our life a bit easier. So what's happening then? They issue bonds, so they've got a liability of 50, but this guy is buying the bond. He has to pay for it, so what happens to his deposits? If you buy for $50 bonds, your deposit is going down to zero. And all of a sudden we change deposits, loans are unchanged. So we have less deposits now with the same amount of loans. So that means we have that example as it was written there in the newspaper article. We have less deposits, same or more loans, and that means the gap between deposit and loans went up. But I hope you can see now that the explanation for it is different to what the explanation there was in the newspaper article. The explanation is not that deposits are floating away. The explanation is that banks feel that they have too much deposits, either this way, so we are trying to sell other securities to our households, or to convince our households or our depositors to switch into different accounts, different to deposit accounts. Savings account would work, for example. Or if you want to get more ESF, I could have done the same thing with more EFS if this guy here has a deposit account at Bank B. Actually, let's do that too, that you can see that, because I started with that explanation. So same story, I just copy that thing down. Okay. So the fund is sitting at zero anyway already. So I've got the $50 household here. I was feeling I had too little ESF. I'm issuing bonds with $50. And this time, the guy that is buying these bonds is sitting at Bank B. So it's the same guy here again, just that his bank account is somewhere else. So let's see what happens here. If he has to pay his deposit account that used to be, let's say, $50 here at Bank B, it's going, of course, down, minus 50. I can make a personal balance sheet for him too. So he used to have deposits 50, they disappear, but he's getting the bond, and I call this bond Bank A, 50. So his deposit account here is disappearing.
And somehow Bank A must be paid now. Since it was Bank B's customer who bought the bond, Bank B has to transfer ESF to Bank A. This time, deposits disappear at Bank B without showing up again at Bank A. Note, it was not the choice of the customer to transfer deposits, but the choice of Bank A to increase bond finance that caused the system-wide deposit drop. Up to now we were talking about domestic transfers. In the article, however, they're talking about international transfers. That means fund managers invested overseas. Surely this seems as if deposits are disappearing. Let's make a very simple example. Let's say I have my account in Bank A in Australia with Australian dollars, of course. And I want to transfer $50 to the US. I want to have 50 Australian dollars transferred into US dollars. So we don't know, minus 50 will clearly disappear from our account. Problem number one is I need US dollars. That means I need to find somebody first who is selling me US dollars against my Australian dollars. So I want to give my 50 Australian dollars away. Let's say the exchange rate is 0.7, so we can calculate it nice and easily in our head. That is resulting into 35 US dollars. And let's say we found someone, Tom, who's willing to do that deal because he needs Australian dollars. He actually needs exactly 50 Australian dollars. Now Tom happens to have his bank account in the US. He used to have 100 US dollars on his account to make it nice and easy. And now, of course, because he's paying for our 50 Australian dollars, 35 US dollars must disappear from his account. And who is getting these 35 US dollars? Well, it was me. But I can't get them in Australia. US dollars are always in the US, except of cash, of course, but we're talking electronic money here. So the simplest example here is if I open an account at Tom's bank in the US, so let's call that bank U in the US. For the bank here, it's simply a reshuffle. So now I have 35 US dollars in the US, readily available for whatever I want to do with it. Similarly, Tom has got now a bank account in Australia where he has 50 Australian dollars readily available for whatever he wants to do. Now the interesting part here is we don't even need any kind of settlement between these two banks. If you look at this, we have minus 50 Australian dollars plus 50 Australian dollars. So this is again nicely balanced. What we basically did is, from the bank's point of view, they owed us Australian dollars, or me, Axel Australian dollars, and now they own the same amount to Tom. Similarly in the US bank used to owe Tom 100 US dollars, and now they owe Tom only 65, but therefore they owe me 35 US dollars. The important thing here to learn is that actually no Australian dollars move towards US. And the reason is, if we change currency, we literally have changed one currency against another one. So what happens, the total amount of Australian dollars didn't change, it's just the ownership that changed. Instead of an Australian Axel owning these Australian dollars now, the foreigner Tom owns these Australian dollars. Similar for the US dollars. The US dollars actually did not travel across the ocean towards Australia. The US dollars are still in the US, just that the ownership now is not Tom anymore, but the owner of these 35 US dollars deposits now is Axel. Now it's of course an extreme coincidence that Tom wants to have a bank account at the same bank and for the same amount of dollars that I just wanted to have spent, and that I'm happy to bank with Tom's bank. Let's make the same example just a little bit more trickier. Let's say there is no Tom. But I still want to get my 50 Australian dollars transferred into 35 US dollars. And let's say Bank U itself is jumping into the market, which is somewhat realistic because lots of the foreign exchange transactions actually happen between banks, partially in the name of their customers. So let's say Bank U is now wanting to buy these 15 Australian dollars. So again, for my account, 50 Australian dollars of course are disappearing, and I'm getting the 35 US dollar account at Bank U. 35 US dollars. Now Bank U is getting 50 Australian dollars, and let's keep it nice and simply and say they're happy to accept an account at my Bank A. So Bank U is getting 50 Australian dollars here. But we're not finished yet as beforehand, because as you can see, Bank U is not balanced yet. So Bank U is now owing me 35 US dollars, but at the same time they got a new asset. They've got an asset at Bank A. That is this account here, 50 Australian dollars. And now we get into a little bit of trouble because of course in the US they can't write 50 Australian dollars into their balance sheet. They have to write down the US dollar equivalent, which is the equivalent of 35 US dollars. Now, why is this a little bit more interesting than the previous case? The interesting part happens here now if the exchange rate changes. For example, over time, the exchange rate might become 0.9. That means now we get 90 US dollar cents, so the Australian dollar has appreciated. It's always good to think about what's happening here, appreciating or depreciating. So if the Australian dollar has appreciated and Bank U owns 50 Australian dollars, is that a good thing or a bad thing for Bank U? Well, if their asset is appreciating, it's a good thing. And we can see that here too, because now 50 Australian dollars are now worth equivalent of 45 US dollars. So these old 35 US dollars now became 45 US dollars because the asset has appreciated. Basically that means the equity and profits increased by 10 US dollars over here. So that is something called double currency accounting or double accounting. What we have to do here is we have to take care not to just write down the US dollar amount, but in fact it's an Australian dollar asset. So we have to write down how many Australian dollars we've got and then the US dollar equivalent. Otherwise we would miss out on these potential foreign exchange risk. In my example it was a positive risk because the Australian dollar appreciated, but it could have easily depreciated and we could have lost 10 US dollars. Note that for Bank A, there is no risk here because we kept everything in Australian dollars. Bank A has nothing to do with US dollars. We could have flipped the whole thing around and say, for example, that the initial deal here was done not with the US bank, but potentially Bank A might have wanted to get a US dollar account too. Then the risk would have sat with Bank A.